Hello again from southeastern Finland in northern Europe. I continue my series of historical videos focusing for the time being on the Second World War because its official 80th anniversary of starting date will come to pass on September the 1st, 1939. Arguably, it began already on July the 7th, 1937, with the start of the Second Chinese-Japanese War, when the Japanese army invaded eastern China. This video is based on the false flag incident or fake attack incident known as the shelling of Mainila, or to translate the Finnish term literally, the shots of Mainila. Mainila was a village on the Soviet side of the Soviet-Finnish border in the southern part of the Karelian Isthmus, a narrow land region shared by the two countries between the First and Second World Wars, or more specifically between the Treaty of Tartu in 1920 and then the Winter War. The Karelian Isthmus is bordered by the Gulf of Finland, the eastern arm of the Baltic Sea in the west, and Lake Ladoga, a large lake, indeed continental Europe's largest lake, in the east. Finland had already mobilized many, if not most of its soldiers by the calling up of reservists for so-called extra refresher exercises starting on October the 10th, 1939. The negotiations on an exchange of territories along the Soviet-Finnish border had broken down on November the 9th, 1939, and both countries had started to begin in earnest for a possible war. Well, the Soviet Union had already prepared its armies along the Soviet-Finnish border for several months. And then the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin wanted a theoretical reason for invading Finland alongside the propaganda output, which claimed that Finland was persecuting its workers especially, and was preparing to attack the Soviet Union. Aside from some Finnish far-rightists, Finland did not want to attack the Soviet Union. And while certain left-wing workers, especially those with communist sympathies, were indeed in trouble with the law, there was no widespread persecution of workers. On Sunday, November the 26th, 1939, when this operation was carried out, there was a huge morning snowstorm, which gradually started to wane around noon Finnish time. And then shortly before 2:30 p.m. Finnish time, some Finnish border guards or Finnish soldiers situated along the border and serving as border guards with their binoculars noticed how in the village of Mainila on the Soviet side of the border, a Soviet army officer rapidly rode with his horse to the bases where some Soviet soldiers were stationed, said something to them, after which these Soviet soldiers quickly left their bases. And after that, 7 cannon shots or shells were observed. Also, the open field on the Soviet side of the border, some 800 meters inside the Soviet Union, where those shells made holes, were observed. And one Finnish military pilot, who was then serving in the Soviet Air Force, was flying alongside the Soviet-Finnish border around 3 p.m. Finnish time, and noticed how from the Soviet side from the so-called curve of Kirjasalo, which was a wedge heading towards Finland, but on the Soviet side, a cannon was being fired towards Mainila. And since Kirjasalo was situated to the northeast of Mainila, either north or northeast of Mainila, if I remember correctly, and since the border between the Soviet Union and Finland was not straight in that wooded landscape, it looked, or could have looked, according to this by now late Finnish military pilot, as if those shots had been fired to Mainila from the Finnish territory. However, because the Finnish military commanders, especially Field Marshal Gustav Mannerheim, were realists, they had wisely withdrawn the Finnish artillery, all the Finnish cannons, so many kilometers from the border that even accidentally, none of them could have shelled any place on the Soviet territory or in the Soviet territory. And then the next night, one of the soldiers in the service of the border guards telephoned the Finnish army's headquarters in Helsinki and told about this incident. Later on November the 27th, 1939, the Soviet government sent a diplomatic note condemning this so-called aggression and demanding that Finland withdraw its forces from the border. The Finnish government replied that based on its investigations and based on the testimonies of the border guards on the Finnish side, Finland could not have fired even accidentally any of those shots or shells. Instead, it proposed that a commission consisting of both Finns and Soviets investigate the incident. It even proposed that both Finland and the Soviet Union withdraw their armed forces a certain number of kilometers away from the border on the Karelian Isthmus to prevent such incidents from occurring again. Instead, the Soviet government unilaterally withdrew from its 1932 non-aggression treaty with Finland on November the 28th and broke off its diplomatic relations with Finland on November the 29th. And then the way was paved for the start of the Soviet invasion of Finland on the morning of November the 30th, 1939, and for the establishment of a puppet regime called the Finnish Democratic Government, in the Finnish historiography often called the Terijoki government, because it was based on the town of Terijoki on the Finnish side of the border. Terijoki was taken by the Soviet forces on December the 1st, 1939. This puppet regime was headed by a Finnish-born communist, Mr. Otto Ville Kuusinen, but already by the last week of January 1940, this puppet regime lost its importance, its significance, and its reason for being, or raison d'être, because the Soviet government, through its envoy or ambassador to Stockholm, Sweden, Miss Alexandra Kollontai, indicated that it was willing to negotiate with the Finnish government on a peace treaty, which meant, of course, that the Soviet Union would not intend to conquer the entire Finland for the time being, and therefore its agreement with the so-called Finnish Democratic Government had become void.